Ever feel like you have compared your own grief or loss to another's? Me too. My hand is up. You are not alone in that. Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and today we're going to have the first of a two-part honest conversation with my friend, Greg Bufkin. You may remember him and his wife, Cathy, from episode 79. We don't have the same types of loss, but we are definitely going to experience some of that during our life, right? Just as a trigger warning, we reference suicide. So if you are in a place with either little ears or you are just working through a tender spot right now, please feel free to move on to another episode. And there is really no guidebook how you deal with loss or grief. And so I hope today's conversation gives you perspective to help you know that a part of your story, it really affects what goes into our heart, our minds, and our soul. Here's my conversation with Greg Bufkin. Well, today we are diving into a conversation about loss and grief and kind of with a more internal perspective. This is going to be part one of two. Greg, we've all experienced grief, but sometimes, at least for me, I kind of put things on a scale of what is most important. So when I hear your story, I almost place you ahead of my grief. Well, I don't know if everyone has that same feeling. So Greg and I have come up with a way to kind of have an honest conversation to look what it is as we walk through life, what we're dealing with on the inside. And in no way are we professionals, but we both feel that sharing our stories allows us to have comfort and understanding, and we know that we're not alone. So Greg, I'd love for you to start, kind of just briefly share your experience with loss or grief in your life.
Well, thank you, Danielle. Before I do, I wanted to address something you just said a moment ago, and that's about putting our grief journeys or experiences on a scale and comparing. Yeah. And, people need to understand that grief comes in a lot of different forms because loss comes in a lot of different forms. So please don't compare yourself, and please then also don't compare someone, for instance, who has been through the loss of a child. Be careful not to say you understand what they've been through or what they're going through because you experienced the death of a grandparent or you experienced the death of a family pet that you were really close to. Those are things you just need to be sensitive to. Our story really and truly begins about 8 years ago, Danielle. I mean, you and I have known each other for a while now, and you know our story. But for those of you who are listening, 2015 brought a change to our world that we never saw coming. In October of that year, October the 25th to be exact, we received a phone call that every parent fears. In that phone call, we learned that our 26-year-old son, Ryan, had taken his own life around midnight that night. I received this phone call at about 7:30 in the morning. Cathy and I were away with another couple up in the mountains of North Carolina, and we were actually getting ready to pack up to go home on a Sunday morning. And we got that phone call, and our lives were shattered. That's an understatement. Yeah. There had been some issues going on with Ryan over the previous 3 or 4 days, but never foresaw anything like this being the result of those issues. So that's where our story begins. And we were very thankful and will always be thankful that God saw it coming. He had another couple that I just mentioned that were there with us. We had been friends with them for a long time. And so when we got that news, they were there with us. We didn't have to try to navigate those first few minutes by ourselves. We had a long trip home, about a 3 or 4 hour drive. And I'll tell you, it's the longest drive that we have ever made in our lives. I don't know how we actually got home. I would say without question, we knew God was there in the car with us. Cathy and I had been believers, followers of Jesus most of our lives. And that day, you know, if you've been a believer for very long, you know we talk about the peace of God that passes understanding, and you don't really know what that means until you really need it. Mm-hmm. And we needed it badly in order to make that drive home. And It made absolutely no sense. It defied human logic, Danielle. But when I got in that car and started to drive away from the hotel, it was like I was enveloped in this peace that I could not explain. I honestly, at some level, started feeling a little guilty about it because I thought I shouldn't be feeling peaceful. We just lost our son. But that was God giving us the peace that we needed to make that drive home safely. Ryan was 26 years old at the time, and what added to the acuteness of that is that he left behind a 9-month-old daughter and a very sweet, beautiful young wife. And so a lot of things ended that day, but that's where our story started.
Well, Greg, thank you for sharing that. And we know that you're not the only parents who've experienced a loss like that. I can't imagine, and I'm sure just the roller coaster of emotions, not only on that day, but as it continued. For myself, between our two children, Eric and I lost a baby. It was very early on, but it's just one of those things you like, oh, the human body produces a child. And it was kind of a surprise. And so you get excited and then it's not happening. You know, I was thinking about it this morning. You know, everyone has like these loss of dreams or things that they imagine are going to happen. And I do believe God has bigger plans for that. I was thinking about the loss of grandparents, not just physically, but, you know, growing up, my dad had a really hard childhood. And so that grandparent relationship was just never there. And maybe that's why I love you so much, Greg.
Yeah. Am I a surrogate grandparent?
It's possible, but because I have seen myself like connect with like older men. I'm like, why do I care so much about this grandparent type figure in my life? So there's that. And also I've experienced loss of friendship. And so the grieving process, while we both have experienced it, it does look different. And it's hard. It's a journey. It's very personal. And so what you said earlier too, and what I alluded to is just like sometimes I take my grief or my loss and I minimize it because I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't lost a child like you've experienced, Ryan, in your life. So I think that's why we wanted to have this conversation, because it is a very personal experience. And so I'd love to know, how has the loss of Ryan affected you on a faith level? Because you said you felt peace on the car ride home, and I believe that was only because of God.
Absolutely.
But I mean, what did faith look like after that?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think everybody who goes through any significant loss comes face to face with how real their faith is. Mm-hmm. Until your faith is tested, in some respects, it may feel real to you, but until it's tested, you don't know whether it's going to hold or not. So let me start by saying this, Danielle. Cathy and I have often shared that had we stepped into this loss apart from a relationship with Jesus, I don't know if or how we would have survived this, because to lose a child is, I think, and this is our perspective, but also the perspective of other parents that I have also interviewed on our podcast, that it might very well be the most devastating and unspeakable loss that a human being can ever walk through. And so when we got that phone call that day, we had an incredible advantage, and that was we weren't doing this alone. Scripture records how Jesus grieved himself. Many of you might know the story of Jesus and his friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And Scripture records that Jesus' friend Lazarus died. And when he was dying, his sisters sent for Jesus to come because they knew that if he came, that Lazarus wouldn't die, because Jesus could heal him. Well, Jesus, according to Scripture, intentionally stayed back for about 4 days. And then when he shows up, everybody, Lazarus has died in the interim. Everybody is mourning and grieving. And of course, they had professional mourners in those days. So it was not a pretty scene, I imagine. A lot of weeping and wailing and all of that. And one of the sisters runs out to him and said, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. And, and Jesus burst into tears. He didn't just get a little teary-eyed. Scripture says that in the original, he burst into tears. Now, if you really stop and think about that, this is God in the flesh. Do you think that he was caught off guard by this? I think he knew what he was facing. I think he knew why he waited. And yet, he lost a friend that day. So he was grieving the loss of his friend, but he was also grieving because Lazarus' sisters were grieving. So Jesus entered into the kind of grief that we encounter every day. He doesn't know it from far away. He knows it because up close and personal, he walked through it himself. And so for Cathy and me that day, as hard as it was and as heart-wrenching as it was, we had the presence of God in us through the Holy Spirit. And he is how we walked out our grief journey. Did that make it easy? Oh, absolutely not. Yeah. No, there is easy and grieving don't go in the same sentence, whether you're a believer or not. But he is how we have walked out that grief journey. It felt impossible in those first few hours and weeks and even a few months. But that's how.
Well, thanks for being honest, because I think sometimes when people think of the Christian faith or just like starting a relationship with Jesus, like it's going to be on the up and up. But I just remind people, like, Jesus went to the cross. He suffered. He didn't say that we are going to just experience a bed of roses for the rest of our life. And also, we just live in a world of sin. We live in a world where things are challenging. And so what you said in the beginning of if we didn't have God to hold on to in that moment, I would just feel like a shattering of like an emptiness, really, of what do I do next?
Yeah. And interestingly enough, in reference back to what you just said a minute ago, Jesus himself, he didn't say as you did. And if you follow me, man, it's going to be so cool. You'll never have any issues. You'll never experience any trouble. You just do all the right things. No, he said, in this world, you will have trouble. Mm-hmm. But take heart because I've overcome this world. But those emotions and the impact of grief are very real. And it's not just the feelings, Danielle, of feeling sad and lost at times, but there's the physical impact. There's the mental impact. There is what we talked about in COVID a lot, that mental fog. Brain fog, that's a real part of grieving. And honestly, even as a believer, feeling just broken and lost at times. There were days when Cathy, my wife Cathy, the thoughts crossed her mind of taking her own life because she just wanted to go home and be with Ryan.
Absolutely, yeah.
So no, like you said, it's not a bed of roses, but we're not doing it alone.
Yeah. Did you ever deal with feeling guilty?
Nah, never.
No. I mean, if I remember correctly, Ryan has struggled with mental health. So this wasn't not necessarily, yes, this season was a surprise. No one could expect this. But I always wonder when somebody, I guess with anything, you kind of wonder, like, could I have done more? Is there something I could have done? And then maybe this trajectory would have changed. Like for me, when we lost our child, I was on birth control. And so I'm like, well, was it my fault that this happened? And I struggled with that for such a long time because I'm like, well, what if? And I do believe that's kind of like the sense of Satan just kind of getting in our brain and helping us distract ourselves from our Father and holding tight to him. What was guilt like for you?
Oh gosh, that is such a big part of it, Danielle. I don't know what it's like for others because I guess it depends on the cause of death in some respects. You know, if someone's taken out in a car accident, if it's a result of homicide, maybe a long terminal illness. I don't know what that's like, but for us, the fact that Ryan took his own life, it produced a lot of guilt, at least initially, because we did think about all of the what ifs. What if we had had one more conversation with him about what he was struggling with? What if we had, instead of driving up to the mountains that weekend, we had instead chosen to drive in the opposite direction down to Charleston, South Carolina, and meet with him personally and try to talk with him if he would have talked with us about it. Not everybody is willing to open up about what's going on in their lives with their parents once they're married, that you don't share everything. And even if we had, and there are a lot of other questions with fill in the blanks, but even if we had, God eventually brought us around to understanding that there were no guarantees that had that happened, that it would have changed the outcome. We don't know that because we don't have the ability to see the future. But as parents, you do wonder about all of those things. You wonder if there was something in their childhood that changed the trajectory of their lives. And I will say, being transparent, because there are people listening today that are dealing with things in the death of their child or even in the death of a spouse, things that maybe you haven't shared with anybody else. We discovered, I guess it was probably 3 years after we lost him, our daughter Whitney had a conversation with someone that Ryan had met and developed a friendship with that he shouldn't have. But what came out of that was a conversation that Whitney ended up having with her 3 years later. And through that conversation, we discovered that Ryan had been molested as a child.
Oh, wow.
And we don't know at what age. We don't know for how long. And Danielle, what added to that, to the gravity of that and the pain of that, was that the perpetrator was my own father.
Oh my gosh, Greg, I'm so sorry.
Ryan's grandpa that he should have been able to trust. And we discovered that it had happened to his cousins as well. And we have since discovered that it happened to our daughter that we didn't know about until 6 months ago. If you look at the statistics surrounding children who have been molested, a lot of times the manifestations of that pain that they endured, the heartache that came out of that, the fear that came out of that, the impact doesn't generally start manifesting until the late teens, sometimes even later in life. This is something that Cathy and I struggled with for actually a good while throughout his mid to late teenage years, was that some of Ryan's characteristics began to change and we couldn't put our finger on why. And we just kind of, to a large extent, contributed that to him just being a typical teenager and going through, just that rebelliousness that we often attribute to that season of life, not understanding the basis of it. And so that in itself produces a whole different level of guilt because as parents, as a dad, I'll speak as a dad, my role is to protect my children. Yeah. And it's really difficult to protect them from something that you are not aware of. And then you feel guilty because of, how did we miss this? Yeah. How could we possibly have missed this? And we understand logically that most often when that happens, the perpetrators will frighten the children. They will threaten them by threatening their loved ones. Yeah. If you tell anybody, then I'm going to harm your loved one, whoever that might be. So for us, in some respects, when we got that news that day, it was like losing Ryan all over again. So that's a long answer about guilt. But yes, I think all parents deal with grief at some levels.
In the juxtaposition of grief, there is this beautiful season of forgiveness. It's a long journey and it is complex because you just said like there's different layers of that.
Right.
So even in that most recent situation, what you just learned about Ryan's and Whitney's childhood, how has that influenced your way to forgive not only yourself, to forgive your dad, to forgive Ryan for not mentioning it as a child? Because you're just like, I want to protect you. How do you forgive?
I think that's something that we all deal with. It's at some level, whether you've lost a child a lot of different areas of life, we face the challenge of forgiveness. And at the heart of it, Danielle, you and I both know this. If you are a follower of Jesus, he commanded us to forgive each other. We've been forgiven a lot. So who are we not to forgive if God has forgiven us through Jesus? So we know that it's not optional. But I think one of the big problems that comes about when we hold on to those hard feelings of unforgiveness is that we have a tendency to look at things like that. I think in our culture, I think even in the Christian community, is too much of an emotion instead of a decision. Does it produce emotions? Oh, absolutely, because there's a range of emotions involved in that. But I would equate unforgiveness to be sort of like drinking poison, a fatal poison every day, just a little bit, not enough to kill me today and not enough to kill me tomorrow. But if I just keep drinking a little bit of it, eventually along the way, it's destroying me on the inside, my internal organs, little by little. And eventually, if it's not addressed, then it will have its final say-so, and it'll kill me. And I think forgiveness is a lot like that, Danielle. It really and truly is a choice, not an emotion. So it's not so much for the other person either. It's for me. And I realized when Whitney shared that news with us, and I'll just use that specific incident as something that was very difficult for me to forgive. I didn't want to forgive my father. I honestly did not want to forgive him. I was, a lot of people talk about being angry with God when something like this happens. I didn't really get angry with God when we lost Ryan. But when I found out what my father had done to Ryan, oh my gosh, I was so angry. I can't even describe that level of anger. And my father was dead at that point in time. So I can remember driving to work, and I traveled a lot. I still had a territory that gave me 2.5-hour drives. And let me tell you, that turned those drives into some very long ones. I had a lot of time to think and to feel and to pray. I had to choose. I can remember where I was, just telling God, I don't want to do this. I do not want to forgive my father. But I know if I don't, it's already eating me on the inside. Not affecting him in the least. So I had to choose to forgive him, and not just one time. It was a process of having to choose to forgive him. And yes, we had to learn to forgive ourselves because of all those things that we talked about earlier. All of the what ifs, what if we had only. So, yeah, I think it's sometimes, for a while at least, it's a daily choice.
Absolutely. I was just telling you this last week, and I was at a women's retreat, and it was talking about having a well-watered life. And we had this picture of this tree, one with its roots, there were no leaves whatsoever. The other one with their roots was well-watered, and it was flourishing with all these leaves. And we talked about what are those roots? What are those things that are holding us back? What are those questions in our mind? And when you were talking about forgiveness, when you choose not to do that, it eats away at you, and you become withered and depleted, and it becomes a disease, really.
Yeah.
And you kind of wonder, why is this one choice of not acting in forgiveness towards either myself or others, why is it affecting my work? Why is it affecting this? And I really believe our faith and forgiveness, there's a much studious word to this, but it's holistic. That's it.
Yeah.
It's
good word.
Holistic in our who we are as our being. It affects every part of us. It affects our decision. And so if we're not choosing to go down to the roots, whether that's forgiveness, whether that's guilt, whether that is something that has been done to us or we've done ourselves and we feel that shame, we can never move past, because we're just going to be captivated into this place of just pain
Yeah, that is so true. It really and truly, you, by not making a decision to forgive, it's like being imprisoned by that circumstance, and you have the key to get out of that prison, and yet it's like just laying that key to the side and never picking it up and choosing to believe that if you use that key, you can step out of that prison. We have the ability to forgive. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's like other things in life. If we make the choice, and that involves our brain, not just what we call our heart or the emotional aspect of it, but when we choose to forgive because we know that's what Jesus told us to do, even if it doesn't make sense, once we do it, we experience the freedom and the emotions follow. But the choice won't follow emotions, because the emotions will keep us imprisoned, and it becomes what you were describing. It becomes like a cancer.
Yeah. Greg, are there any specific emotions or I guess really moments that have been difficult for you? I mean, this seems obvious, like holidays, things that you felt like never had a chance to happen, because you said when Ryan passed away in 2015, he left behind his wife and his daughter. And so there's like certain moments that you think, well, as a grandfather, like, here's what I'm going to get to experience. This is what I'm going to be able to see with my son down the road.
Yeah.
What has that been like for you, and how have you managed? How have you moved on? How have you processed through that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Danielle, because again, it's something that all of us have to walk through. Let me address that in two different ways, or there's two different aspects of that. The first one is something that people on the outside really don't pick up on a lot of times, and that is the fact that someone who has walked through a season of grief like that, or is walking through that season of grief, there is an entire year of firsts. And if that's not readily apparent at first, let me just make it really simple, because it really is simple. You know, it's the first birthday without your child, the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, the first everything, anything that you celebrated together as a family or as a couple or with your child one-on-one. You know, it's just those things that you enjoyed doing together. There's going to be an entire year of experiencing that the very first time without your child. Those times are very acutely painful. And, you know, in our culture, we talk a lot, we laugh a lot about, well, you know, if something's painful, just rip it off like a Band-Aid. Well, there are times like that on your grief journey, and I'll address that secondly. First, that year of firsts, those are things that you see coming. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know that Christmas is coming, you know when your child's birthday is. So, you know, when you start getting close to that, there's this apprehension and there's some anxiety and some worry about how you're going to get through it, how you're going to process through that, because you feel like you've already been through enough pain. And now you're going to have to face their birthday. You're going to have to face whatever it is. And so it's like somebody slowly peeling a Band-Aid off of a very significant wound over the course of some days or even weeks. And so it brings back some of that early acute pain. Now, what I referred to a minute ago about experiencing that ripping off the Band-Aid effect, those are the things on your grief journey that catch you by surprise. I call them ambushes, where you hear a song, and it's a song that your child loved, a song that your child shared with you because it meant something to them. And maybe you open a drawer and there's something that your child made for you in preschool when they were 3 years old, and they had written it, you know, with their own little hand. Things like that you don't expect to see or hear or feel. It maybe you open a closet and there's the scent of their cologne. And it's like, oh my gosh, it will almost bring you to your knees. Oh, I'll give you an example of something that just happened last week. Cathy and I were at Lowe's, the home improvement store that is. And so we're walking in and we come face to face with Ryan's friend, Trey. Trey was Ryan's best friend, and we had not seen him I think, since Ryan's funeral. And for us, it was like, it just sort of took our breath away seeing Trey.
Yeah.
We've got a picture at home, in our home, of Ryan and Trey. They were just good buddies. And so those connections like that are connections that somebody has with our son that are instant connections for us. And I can remember, we hugged him as we walked away. And as Cathy and I were getting a little bit further away, it was like we were quiet for a couple of minutes. And then it was like, oh my gosh, just seeing Trey brings back this flood of memories and emotions that we weren't necessarily prepared for. And it left us feeling, just a little bit weak-kneed. That's kind of what it's like in everyday life. But, Danielle, also, I want to be very clear, too, in saying that's not how we live our lives every day. We're not consciously in a state of grief every day. Mm-hmm. Being down and depressed and just feeling that loss all the time because of our relationship with Jesus. On our grief journey, which will last for the rest of our lives, we also experience this incredible joy and peace, the peace that we talked about earlier. We experience just a full, rich life now. Yes, we'll always have those. We'll carry the scars of having lost Ryan. And yes, there will be times in our lives when, just in the course of an everyday event, like going to Lowe's, something might touch that scar and it might be a little bit sensitive. But God has healed that very acute phase of our grief. So yeah, that's just a sort of a glimpse of what it's been like for us.
I think also just like the waves of how grief work, like in an ocean, like it's God is with you. And at certain times you're going to feel this, because if we felt it like a tsunami all at once, which I'm sure we feel that, but he's just like so good and generous to be careful with our hearts. It's because we're like learning in different seasons. We're understanding maybe our connection with him or what's happening. Like it was probably a beautiful experience to see Trey.
Oh, it was.
But also at the same time, just to know how far God has brought you and Cathy through this as well.
That is so true. Cathy and I are so blessed. Life is, I can say this now, Danielle, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I don't know if I could have said it with as much conviction, but our lives are so good. We've been through the worst, and I think it gives you perspective that when you've been through the worst, it puts everything else into perspective. Because as you said at the beginning, it affects every aspect of your being and who you are.
Absolutely. When you were talking, I was just curious. Did you feel like you had to hold it together? Like you had to be the rock for Cathy? You had to be the rock for Whitney? Or did you just I can't do that?
Yes and yes. So yes, as a dad and as a husband, I see it as my role to not only support, but to protect, as we talked about earlier, to be there for them, to walk with them through this because they're carrying grief as well. And it's not because I have this superhuman ability to do something that they can't do. It's just, it's who I am. And it's who I am because of who lives in me. It's because of my relationship with Jesus. And I felt that way, yes, but also at the same time, there was an understanding that they also have God's Spirit living within them. So what I had, they also have and had available to them. I could not be who God is supposed to be for them, but I could be his representative to them. I could be a good listener. I could be there to help them with physical things that needed to be done. I could be there to just simply to offer my presence, just like Cathy offered her presence to me. It was a lot harder for Whitney, our daughter, because she was married at the time and had a young child too. But yes, I did feel all of that, but I didn't carry a weight that was unbearable, Danielle. And that's what I want people to understand, because Scripture even talks about, I think it's in 1 Thessalonians, that we don't grieve like those who don't know, this, and I'm paraphrasing, like those who don't know Jesus, because we have been comforted by the one who is able to comfort perfectly. And so we grieve, but we grieve with this hope that we will see Ryan again one day and be reunited with him one day, because we know that Ryan was a believer as well, because he initiated that conversation with me when he was 5 years old. I didn't go to him. He came to me, and we had that conversation. He had a conversation with our pastor, and he went on to be baptized. And so we have the absolute knowledge that we will be reunited with him one day. Yeah. And so very thankful to know that.
That is the beautiful part of our relationship with God, that through him, through Jesus dying, that we have an abundant hope that is for the future. I know that we will also see the child that we lost, that we never got to meet, that I think it's a he, that he's going to be waiting for us once we get to heaven.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe the same for you and Cathy. And just to know that hope is so life-giving in a world that, it can diminish so easily. To have that a part of our lives, that is such a gift.
Absolutely. I don't know how we would have made it had we not had that absolute certainty. But yeah, thank you for being so sensitive to that.
I am very sensitive. And I think about that for myself. I think about that for other people. I'm sure for both of us, doing these podcasts and sharing people's story, it helps us better empathize and understand all these different perspectives and what people have walked through, and to not minimize our own pain or loss or grief. Maybe you have had financial troubles. Maybe you have gone through job loss, or you've lost a friend that you have loved and you're just confused. The beautiful thing is that in our faith, we can walk hand in hand. Like Psalm 23 says, as you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you're not walking alone. He is behind you. He is guiding you on your way. And so, gosh, that is so comforting to know that he's our shepherd, he's our guide. And when we feel so weak, so lost, feeling like we're trying to hold it together, he is right there beside us each and every step of the way.
Yeah, you could not have said that any better, Danielle. And I would just say to anybody who's listening right now, and you're not sure that you have that hope, it's such a simple message. I would just say, just give Jesus a try. What have you got to lose?
Just give him a try. So, well, Greg, this has been a lovely conversation. I know we're going to have another one coming up on the next episode, but
I can't wait.
Thank you so much for sharing your heart and your thoughts today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Danielle. It has been such an honor.
I hope that you were encouraged by our conversation today, and it made you reflect a bit on what loss and grief has looked like for you. All the ways to connect with Greg or hear his podcast, you can simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Greg. Number 1, grief is a deeply personal experience. So how do you deal with any guilt, like you didn't do enough or you could have done something differently, without it overcoming you? Number 2, forgiveness is often a very complex aspect of grief. Have there been moments when your faith has influenced your ability to forgive either yourself or your others in the aftermath? If you like this episode, next week we're going to have a conversation what it looks like to go out in the world and, yes, talk to others. In the meantime, if you want to hear a more detailed account of Greg and Cathy's story, you can check out episode number 79. Also, I appreciate my husband Eric for his editing abilities in making our conversation shine. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God is with you, even when you experience pain, when you feel shame, or you feel guilt. He is there. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.